German troops mocked the Soviet winter until they watched an entire highway rise from a frozen lake and save a dying city. December 1st, 1941, southern shore of Lake Ladoga, east of Leningrad. The wind screams across the frozen surface like something alive. A white void stretches to the horizon, broken only by distant pillars of smoke rising from burning villages. The temperature has fallen below 30 degrees Celsius. Rifles freeze if left unattended, boots crack from the cold, and men breathe clouds thick enough to hide behind. But something impossible is happening out on the lake. German forward observers from the 18th Army stand behind snow-covered sandbags, binoculars pressed to their frost-bitten faces. For hours, they have watched dark shapes move against the glowing ice. At first, they thought it must be a mirage, heat distortion, phantom lights, a trick of the brain in deadly cold. But as the shapes multiply, as engines rumble across a lake that should kill any machine, disbelief turns into unease. Unmöglich, one officer mutters. No truck could survive out there. Yet trucks are moving, slowly, cautiously, far out on the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga, and every kilometer they advance brings Leningrad closer to survival. Context: the siege tightens. By the winter of 1941, Leningrad was dying. The German Army Group North had closed the ring around the city. Finnish forces blocked the northern escape route, and the Luftwaffe hammered rail lines, warehouses, and the last operating food depots. Inside the city, more than 3 million civilians shivered in unheated apartments. Bread rations fell to starvation levels. People collapsed in tram cars, on stairwells, and in snowdrifts outside bakeries that no longer had flour. Hitler's order was explicit: Leningrad is to be erased from the face of the earth. What he did not consider was the Soviet Union's ability to improvise under pressure, especially when engineers, soldiers, and civilians were told that the only alternative to success was extinction. The impossible proposal. The idea came from the Soviet Leningrad Front's logistics officers. If the railways were cut, if the roads were destroyed, if every land route was under German artillery, then the only direction left was across frozen water. Lake Ladoga was massive, 200 kilometers long, up to 1,000 feet deep, swept by brutal winds. In early winter, the ice was treacherous, thin, unpredictable. But if the temperature continued to fall, if the ice thickened just enough, they could build a road of ice. A road that would defy every expectation the Germans had about Soviet capability. A road that would become known as Doroga Zhizny, the road of life. Within hours of the idea being approved, teams of engineers marched onto the lake with sleds carrying drills, timber stakes, ropes, and improvised measuring tools. Every few meters, a man knelt and bored into the ice, checking its thickness with numb hands. If the ice groaned, they moved. If it cracked, they marked the danger and adjusted the path. For 48 hours, the engineers hardly slept. Snow blinded their vision. Artillery thundered from the southern shore as German batteries tried to disrupt the surveying teams. But by December 18th, a crude map existed, a route that twisted like a serpent across the lake, following pockets where the ice was thickest. Stalin demanded that trucks use it immediately. The engineers protested. It is not ready. The reply was simple: it must be. First convoy, a miracle on ice. On the night of November 20th, 1941, the first convoy ventured onto the lake. 3 trucks, engines sputtering, drivers wrapped in rags and quilts, headlights dimmed to avoid Luftwaffe patrols. The men crossed themselves. Some kissed medallions of saints. Others muttered cynical jokes about dying as frozen statues. Every kilometer forward was a risk. The ice moaned like a living thing. Cracks spiderwebbed beneath tires. Drivers kept speeds below 15 kilometers per hour. Too slow, the ice would collapse under static weight. Too fast, the vibrations could shatter it. 4 hours later, against every prediction, the trucks reached the opposite shore. Alive, intact, and loaded with 33 tons of survival. Flour, medicine, kerosene, ammunition. Inside Leningrad, when the news spread, people wept. Outside Leningrad, on the German front line, officers refused to believe the report. They had seen Soviet logistics fail repeatedly. They had watched Red Army units starve, freeze, collapse. But this, building a winter highway across a lake, was something no commander in the Wehrmacht had planned for. And as more convoys followed, the Germans realized the truth. The Soviets had built the impossible, and they had done it in days, not months. Welcome to WW2 Forgotten Fronts, a channel dedicated to the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the hidden machines that shaped the Second World War. Here we dive beyond the famous headlines to uncover stories buried in diaries, lost archives, and forgotten frontlines. If you're passionate about deep storytelling, real wartime experiences, and cinematic history, you've just found your new home. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. Morning reconnaissance flights of Luftwaffe Ju-88s passed over the southern tip of Lake Ladoga at low altitude, cameras clicking as pilots scanned the barren ice. They expected to find nothing. No movement, no structures, no tracks. Frozen lakes were death traps, not roads. But then the film developed. Thin, wavering lines appeared, parallel ruts carved across the white surface. The lines twisted, curved, branched, and they were growing thicker every day. At first, German intelligence officers insisted they were animal trails or weather patterns. But the photos kept coming back the same. One Oberleutnant in the 4th Air Fleet jabbed a finger at the image and growled, "Das sind Reifenspuren." Those are tire tracks. The room fell silent. If those were indeed tire tracks, then the Red Army was moving heavy vehicles, possibly hundreds of them, across ice that should not support their weight. The conclusion was unthinkable. The Soviets had created a functional road system on the lake. German officers argued among themselves. This is propaganda. No ice can hold a military truck. If they attempt mass movement, the ice will break and they'll drown. It must be some kind of deception. But the truth was unavoidable. Every hour, Soviet supply convoys were inching across Lake Ladoga, feeding the city the Germans wanted to starve. And not just feeding it, saving it. Inside Leningrad, the city awakens. By the final days of November 1941, Leningrad resembled a frozen graveyard. Bread rations had dropped to 250 grams for workers, 125 grams for everyone else. Families boiled wallpaper glue for calories. People collapsed on sidewalks, too weak to move. Entire blocks sat in silence except for the howling wind. Then the first trucks from the road of life rolled into the city. They carried flour, fuel, medical supplies, ammunition, even fresh troops to replace exhausted defenders. Workers lined the streets, tears freezing on their cheeks, watching the impossible convoy growl past them as if it were a vision. Drivers stepped from their cabs, faces frostbitten, eyes swollen from exhaustion. And people reached out to touch their coats, their hands, as if they were heroes returning from the dead. One old woman whispered, "Chudo, a miracle." The Soviet authorities immediately set up unloading brigades, repair stations, and warming huts for drivers. Within 72 hours, the city that had been sentenced to death was breathing again. How the Soviets built the road so quickly? German analysts would later ask, how did they do it? How did they build a winter highway faster than we could react? The answer came from a uniquely Soviet combination of improvisation, desperation, and sheer human will. 1. Thousands of civilians were mobilized overnight. Men, women, teenagers, even factory workers too old to serve, were marched onto the ice carrying shovels, axes, and crowbars. They hacked open snowdrifts, packed down ruts, cut branches to mark safe zones. 2. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock. They mapped ice thickness every few hours, adjusting routes constantly. If one path cracked, they opened another. 3. Repair crews stood by with timber beams and portable stoves. If the ice sagged, they reinforced it. If it fractured, they sealed it with slush and refroze it using blowtorches and burning oil. 4. The NKVD enforced discipline with ruthless efficiency. Trucks moved at precise intervals and speeds. Anyone who ignored ice safety instructions was removed instantly. Order was maintained through fear, yet it kept the convoys alive. 5. Drivers were chosen from the toughest veterans. These were men who had survived the chaos of the Baltic Front, the retreat from Estonia, the battles for the Karelian Isthmus. They understood danger. They understood cold. They drove with nerves of steel. And most importantly, the Soviets had no alternative. Failure meant the extinction of Leningrad. The Germans strike back. By early December, German commanders realized the ice road was not a temporary trick. It was a strategic artery, and they prepared to cut it. Artillery batteries were repositioned closer to the shoreline. Heavy guns opened fire across the lake, shells whistling low over the ice and exploding in towering geysers of water and steam. Shrapnel tore through convoys, blasting trucks into pieces. Luftwaffe aircraft launched attack runs. Stukas diving with sirens screaming, dropping bombs that cracked the ice like thunder. Drivers swerved wildly, trying to avoid fresh fractures that could swallow them whole. One Soviet driver later recalled, "You did not fear the Germans. You feared the ice. It could kill you without sound." But the trucks kept moving, in daylight, in snowstorms, under artillery and bombs. At night, guided only by lanterns shielded with tin. Every convoy that crossed meant thousands more Leningrad citizens would live another day. A turning point in the siege. By mid-December, the Germans faced an outrageous truth. Despite their blockade, despite their firepower, despite the brutal winter, Leningrad was not dying. It was adapting. It was enduring. And it was because of a road the Wehrmacht insisted could not exist. The German war diaries of the period contain phrases rarely seen elsewhere in the early war. The Russians are showing unexpected ingenuity. Enemy supply lines appear to be functioning in impossible conditions. Morale in Leningrad seems not to have collapsed as expected. The road across ice, what German officers mocked as a fantasy, was proving to be one of the most important lifelines of the entire Eastern Front, and the Germans were still underestimating it. By late December 1941, the impossible had become routine. Convoys were no longer a handful of trucks moving cautiously at night. They were long, thundering columns stretching across the frozen lake, their engines echoing off the ice like distant thunder. Each truck carried one precious load: life. The route widened as engineers reinforced weak points with fresh ice blocks and timber. Markers, branches, flags, wooden stakes sprang up like a strange forest across the lake, guiding drivers through safe channels. Field kitchens were stationed at rest stops, their smoke drifting into the frozen air. Even medical tents were pitched on platforms carved from the ice itself. To the Germans observing from the southern shore, it looked less like a supply line and more like a city materializing on the frozen water. A Hauptmann of the 58th Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "They are building roads, camps, even shelters, on a lake. This is madness, and yet, there it is." For a German army trained to see Soviet soldiers as inferior, undisciplined, and technologically backward, the sight was disturbing. The ice road shattered their expectations and revealed a Red Army far more adaptive than any intelligence estimate had predicted. A deadly balance: ice thickness versus survival. The success of the Road of Life depended on a fragile equilibrium. If the ice was too thin, trucks would break through and sink. If it was too thick, German artillery could more easily predict the stable zones and target them. So Soviet engineers constantly monitored the lake, drilling hundreds of thickness tests per day. A typical day's pattern: 6 a.m., ice patrol departs to check overnight cracks. 10 a.m., convoys begin crossing. 2 p.m., German artillery starts shelling routes. 6 p.m., engineers rush to repair shattered sections. 9 p.m., night convoys push through darkness and fog. Midnight, emergency crews rescue broken-down vehicles. 3 a.m., frost deepens, strengthening the ice again. The lake breathed like a living creature, expanding, contracting, groaning beneath the weight of war. One driver described the sound, "It was like thunder under your feet. The ice spoke, sometimes it screamed." Death on the ice. The Road of Life was a miracle, but it was also a graveyard. The ice took its toll ruthlessly. Sometimes a truck hit a weak patch and plunged through in seconds, the driver trapped inside as freezing water flooded the cabin. Sometimes artillery shells shattered the surface into jagged shards that drifted like floating knives. Sometimes the road simply broke. One convoy commander recalled a terrifying event near the center of the lake. A low boom echoed across the ice. A crack stretched from one horizon to the other like a lightning bolt. The entire road heaved upward, then buckled. Drivers slammed on their brakes. The ice split open, wide enough to swallow a man. Dozens of trucks were stranded. Engineers sprinted onto the lake with planks, ropes, and barrels, throwing improvised bridges across the gap, while drivers chanted prayers through chattering teeth. All the while, German artillery began walking shells closer and closer. Remarkably, most of the vehicles were saved, but hundreds of Soviet soldiers and civilian volunteers would die during the winter campaign, frozen, crushed, drowned, or torn apart by bombs. Still, the convoys came, every night, every day, without pause, because Leningrad had no other choice. Inside Leningrad, a city fighting to live, with each truckload, the city's pulse grew stronger. Flour was ground into bread, still barely edible, still tiny in ration size, but enough to keep a person from collapsing on the street. Kerosene heated makeshift hospitals. Ammunition allowed defenders to repel probing German attacks along the southern front. Even horses arrived across the ice, pulling sleds loaded with supplies. Most importantly, the road of life began evacuating civilians. Thousands of children were carried across the lake under blankets, huddled against the cold as bombs exploded in the distance. Mothers kissed their hands goodbye, not knowing whether they would ever meet again. A schoolteacher wrote, "The trucks brought food and hope, but when they left, they carried away our future." German attempts to destroy the road intensify. Realizing the ice road was now the decisive factor preventing Leningrad from falling, the Germans intensified their attacks. 1. Precision artillery fire. Batteries ranged the lake daily, firing shells in patterns designed to destabilize ice, not just hit vehicles. Entire sections of the route became off-limits for days. 2. Air superiority strikes. Stukas and He-111 bombers flew relentless sorties. Pilots aimed not at trucks, but at weak points in the ice. Bombs were dropped with delayed fuses, so they exploded beneath the surface, sending shockwaves through hidden layers. 3. Deployment of long-range guns. Heavy artillery from the 18th Army was hauled into new positions to hit the farthest points of the route, places once believed to be safe. But no matter how many times the Germans cut the road, the Soviets reopened it. Sometimes within hours. A frustrated Wehrmacht report concluded, "The Russians treat the lake as if it were solid ground. Their resilience is beyond reason." The Germans realized the truth. By January 1942, one chilling realization spread among German officers. Leningrad would not starve. Not as long as the road of life existed. The idea that Soviet engineers could carve a logistical artery across shifting ice, under fire in temperatures deadly to machinery, and keep it functioning for months was something the Wehrmacht had simply not accounted for. It was a miscalculation that would haunt Army Group North for the entire war. By early January 1942, the temperature around Lake Ladoga plunged to nearly minus 40 degrees Celsius. Breath froze into needles. Steel shattered like glass. Engines needed open fires beneath them just to turn over. Men wrapped newspapers inside their uniforms to stop the wind from cutting through their bones. But the colder it became, the stronger the road of life grew. The ice thickened into a load-bearing platform capable of supporting not just trucks, but mass transport columns, tractors, horse-drawn sleds, armored cars, anti-aircraft guns, even makeshift buses. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now a full-scale logistical artery feeding a city of nearly 3 million people. German artillery crews stared through rangefinders in disbelief. Every day, Soviet traffic increased. Every day, more trucks appeared. Every day, the ice road became more permanent. A Feldwebel of the 217th Infantry Division wrote, "By force of will, the Russians have created a bridge where none should exist. We fire, we bomb, we shell, yet the bridge remains." Luftwaffe attempts a knockout blow. On January 12th, the Luftwaffe launched its most coordinated attack yet. Over 40 Ju-87 Stukas, escorted by fighters, swooped down on the convoys. Their bombs detonated in fountains of ice and water, geysers erupting like frozen volcanoes. Trucks skidded, swerved, and slammed into one another as shockwaves rippled across the surface. The pilots later reported, "We saw vehicles thrown into the air, but the road itself would not break." The reason was simple. Soviet engineers had learned to read the lake. They identified ice veins, zones where pressure ridges absorbed shock. They deliberately routed trucks across sections that flexed without collapsing. They placed decoy markers, tricking German pilots into bombing empty stretches of ice. What the Germans believed was luck was in fact engineering brilliance forged under extreme necessity. Soviet air defense joins the battle. As the Luftwaffe intensified attacks, the Soviets responded by deploying an entire mosaic of anti-air defenses across the lake's perimeter. 37mm AA guns were installed on sled-mounted platforms. Maxim machine guns were placed at choke points. Searchlights carved white blades into the night sky. Fighter patrols from the Ladoga air corridor intercepted bombers' bursts. Soviet gunners often fired until their hands bled, frostbite tearing at their fingers as they reloaded ammunition. Stukas dove through curtains of tracer fire, but many never pulled up. Crashed aircraft littered the lake edges, black, twisted metal frozen in place like tombstones. A German pilot wrote after a narrow escape, "The Russians defend that road with the fury of the damned." Evacuation of civilians, a tragedy and triumph. As the road became more efficient, the Soviets shifted focus toward evacuating civilians, children, the elderly, the sick. Entire waves of refugees trudged toward the lake, escorted by soldiers with rifles slung across frosted shoulders. Many of these evacuees had survived months without heat, without food, listening to artillery thunder across the city every night. For them, the road of life was the only path out of hell. But the crossing was brutal. Winds sliced through blankets. Ice storms turned convoys into ghostly lines. Bombers hunted them like prey. Trucks slid into cracks that opened without warning. Still, more than 500,000 civilians were transported across Lake Ladoga during the siege. For many, the moment they stepped onto the truck ramp at the eastern shore was the first time they had felt hope since the city was encircled. A young evacuee later recalled, "I remember the noise of the truck. I remember the cold. But most of all, I remember the feeling that we were finally leaving death behind." German miscalculations deepen. By midwinter, it was clear the Germans had severely underestimated Soviet determination and innovation. Their intelligence reports repeatedly dismissed the ice road as unreliable, temporary, doomed to collapse. Yet here it was, growing, strengthening, expanding. And with every truckload delivered across Lake Ladoga, the German plan to starve Leningrad unraveled a little more. One senior German officer was overheard saying, "We can break armies, but how do you break a people who turn a lake into a highway?" A psychological turning point. The road of life was not simply a supply line. It was a symbol. To the Soviets, it meant, "The city will not fall. We will not die. We will endure." To the Germans, it meant, "We misjudged them. We do not fully understand the enemy we are fighting." And as trucks moved day and night across the ice, the balance of morale shifted. Leningrad, starving, freezing, bleeding, still refused to die. The Germans had expected collapse. What they witnessed instead was defiance carved into ice. And the worst realization was still ahead. The road of life was only the beginning. By February 1942, the Earth tilted ever so slightly toward the sun. Temperatures rose by just a few degrees, barely noticeable to the average soldier, but enough to change everything on Lake Ladoga. The ice began to shift. Subtle at first, groans, pops, low rumbles in the night. Then fractures appeared like black lightning beneath the convoys. Drivers knew the signs. A shiver through the steering wheel, a sudden dip on the right side, a hollow echo under the tires. The road of life, forged in the deepest cold, was waking from its winter rigidity and becoming unpredictable again. This was the most dangerous phase of all. Not the bombings, not the artillery, not the German attacks, but the melt. For Soviet engineers, it was a race against time. They needed to push as many supplies and evacuate as many civilians as possible before the ice finally gave way and the lake turned back into open water. German command tries one more time to break the road. Knowing the melt would weaken the ice, German commanders launched a final desperate effort to destroy the road before spring rendered it unusable. 1. Artillery barrages intensified. Heavy batteries were ordered to fire continuously, aiming not at convoys, but at pressure ridges where cracks could expand. They hoped a single well-placed explosion would cascade into a chain reaction across the lake. 2. Luftwaffe bombing runs escalate. More Stukas, more Heinkels, more fighter escorts. Bombing frequency tripled. Pilots reported seeing ice sheets shift like tectonic plates beneath their blasts. 3. Saboteur teams were proposed. One far-fetched plan involved infiltrating the lake by night to plant explosive charges along the route. It was never executed. The temperatures and Soviet patrols made it suicide. 4. Psychological warfare attempts, leaflets, were dropped over Soviet positions, claiming the road was doomed and urging surrender. The response from Leningrad's defenders was cold contempt. They burned the leaflets for warmth. Despite these efforts, the road of life remained open, damaged, cracked, splintered, but open. A frustrated German staff officer wrote, It is as if the Russians have chained the lake to their will. The ice begins to fail, a nightmare for drivers. As March approached, the melt accelerated. The lake no longer groaned, it roared. Sheets of ice collided, creating jagged ridges taller than a man. Water seeped through fractures and refroze into transparent veins that reflected moonlight like polished steel. Drivers described the sound of crossing the road as traveling over a living beast. Dozens of trucks were lost. Some plunged through holes that appeared without warning. Others became wedged between rising pressure ridges. Sometimes convoys had to maneuver through corridors only a few meters wide, flanked by walls of ice. A surviving driver recalled, "You could hear the water beneath you. You felt it. It was like driving above your own grave." Still, they kept going. Inside Leningrad, the city refuses to die. March 1942 was still one of the deadliest months of the siege. Famine remained brutal, artillery thudded daily, and diseases spread in unheated apartments. But the difference now was monumental. The city had learned to survive. Soup kitchens operated again. Ammunition stocks were replenished. Factories revived limited operations. Anti-air defenses grew stronger. Morale, though fragile, was no longer collapsing. The Road of Life had done more than feed Leningrad. It had given its defenders the strength to fight on. A factory worker wrote in her diary, "The lake is our guardian. Every truck is a heartbeat." Evacuations reach a climax. As the ice weakened, the Soviets rushed to evacuate as many civilians as possible. Lines of refugees stretched for kilometers. Children wrapped in quilts, elderly leaning on homemade crutches. Mothers whispering prayers as they stepped onto trucks already sagging from the ice's strain. Some convoys did not make it. A truck packed with evacuees fell through a hidden fissure near the center of the lake. Rescue teams managed to pull a few survivors from the freezing water, but dozens were lost forever under the shifting plates of ice. These tragedies became part of the Road of Life's legacy, proof of both sacrifice and necessity. The ice road closes, but the Germans have already lost. By April 1942, the Road of Life began shutting down. The ice could no longer support trucks. Rivers of meltwater carved channels across the surface. Entire sections crumpled into slush. But by this point, the damage to the German strategy was irreversible. The Red Army had saved the city from starvation, reinforced its frontline units, evacuated hundreds of thousands of civilians, restored key industrial capacity, bought time to strengthen defenses. The Germans, who had expected Leningrad to collapse by winter, were stunned. Their blockade had failed. Their siege, meant to be swift, was turning into a drawn-out deadlock. A bitter German officer recorded, "We never believed they could build such a thing. We never believed they could maintain it. And now we pay for our disbelief." The Road of Life was gone, but not forgotten. As spring thawed Lake Ladoga, the Road of Life vanished beneath crashing waves. But its impact remained. It was a triumph of human determination over nature, over starvation, over war. And for the Germans, it was a reminder that the Soviet enemy was not the one they had expected. They had seen the Red Army retreat. They had seen its early disasters. They thought they understood its limits. But the Road of Life showed them something new. The Soviets would endure the impossible to survive. And the Germans had underestimated that, fatally. Summer 1942. A new phase of the siege begins. With the lake fully thawed, the Road of Life transformed once more, not into a highway of trucks, but into a naval lifeline. The Soviets immediately mobilized every available vessel: barges, fishing boats, tugboats, paddle steamers, even repaired wrecks dragged up from Ladoga's icy depths. The Germans believed the supply effort would collapse without the winter ice. It didn't. It simply changed shape. The Red Army constructed new piers, strengthened coastal batteries, and established smokescreen units to hide the convoys from the Luftwaffe. Where drivers had once braved cracking ice and artillery shells, now sailors guided convoys through storms, waves, and strafing runs. Once again, the Germans watched in disbelief as the Soviets adapted with astonishing speed. A report from Army Group North stated, "The enemy is improvising beyond expectations. Their ability to convert obstacles into supply routes is extraordinary." Ladoga became a battlefield of its own, one of fog, water, and relentless air attacks. The Luftwaffe attacks the lake convoys. German pilots had expected easy kills. The The Soviet ships were slow, overloaded, and poorly armored. But when the first major Luftwaffe strike descended upon them in July 1942, the pilots faced a surprise. The Soviets had learned from the winter air raids. Smoke generators cloaked the convoys in thick white walls. Anti-aircraft barges fired streams of tracer rounds. Fighter escorts from the Ladoga air corridor challenged bombers head-on. Camouflage nets disguised dockyards. Decoy barges lured German attacks toward empty water. Archival records show that German bombers often dropped their bombs into smoke clouds, hoping to hit something, anything. Many bombs missed. But the ships kept coming, day after day, night after night. Leningrad continued to breathe. Inside the city, the will to survive hardens. By the summer of 1942, Leningrad was still suffering, but it had changed profoundly. The people were thinner, older, haunted by the hunger winter, but also resilient in a way that shocked invaders and even their own leaders. Factories resumed operation, producing artillery shells and tank components despite constant power outages. Workers sometimes collapsed at their machines, revived with a sip of thin soup, and continued working. Children joined fire brigades. Women manned anti-aircraft posts. Students cleared rubble from bombed streets. The city had become a fortress, not only of stone and steel, but of spirit. A diary entry from a young woman reads, "We have already died once. Now we survive out of defiance." The road of life had not only fed the city, it had given it a reason to endure. German troops reflect on a failed strategy. On the front lines south of Leningrad, German soldiers began voicing what officers already feared. The siege had stalled. The Red Army was not collapsing. The city was not surrendering. The people were not dying fast enough to fulfill Hitler's timetable. A German artillery officer wrote in frustration, "We pound them, we starve them, we freeze them, and still they stand." The psychological impact of the road of life on German morale was profound. Many felt they were fighting against nature itself, against an enemy who refused to obey the logic of war. One infantryman confessed, "Every time we knocked them down, something lifted them back up." That something was the lake. A second winter, and the road returns. As 1942 drew toward winter again, Soviet engineers prepared for the return of the ice road. But this time, they were not improvising. They had experience, they had data, they had improved equipment, they had more men, more planning, more resolve. By late November 1942, the lake froze once more, and the road of life reopened, stronger and more efficient than in its first year. Convoys doubled in size, navigation markers improved, anti-aircraft defenses upgraded, evacuation speed increased. To the Germans, it was a nightmare repeating itself. A senior staff officer remarked bitterly, "Last winter, we underestimated their desperation. This winter, we underestimated their skill." Leningrad begins to fight back. By early 1943, the supplies brought over the road of life enabled the Soviets to prepare a massive counteroffensive. The plan: break the German blockade from the inside. Operation Iskra, Spark, launched on January 12, 1943. Soviet forces smashed through the narrowest point of the German encirclement along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. After months of brutal fighting, they succeeded. A land corridor to Leningrad was opened, the first since the siege began. The ice road did not die. It became a supplement to the new supply line. Trains and trucks now crossed land routes, while the lake convoys operated in parallel. For the Germans, this was the final confirmation. The siege was lost the moment the Soviets built the ice road. From that moment on, time slowly shifted in the Soviets' favor. The German High Command's bitter reflection may. In later interrogations and war diaries, German officers repeatedly admitted their greatest shock of the Leningrad campaign. The Russian ability to build and maintain the Ladoga supply route under combat conditions was beyond anything we anticipated. Another officer added, "We believed winter was our ally. We did not expect the Russians to turn it into a weapon." The road of life was more than an engineering feat. It was a strategic humiliation for the Wehrmacht, a reminder that the Soviet Union, once underestimated, was capable of astonishing feats when cornered. And it was only the beginning of the Red Army's rise. By mid-1943, as the Wehrmacht reeled from defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, analysts in Army Group North were still trying to understand how the Soviets had pulled off the road of life. The Germans conducted an exhaustive review, interrogating prisoners, examining captured documents and studying reconnaissance photos taken during the winter of 1941 to 42. The result shocked them. They discovered that the Soviets had mobilized over 60,000 civilians in the first 2 weeks, performed continuous ice thickness mapping around the clock, built dozens of alternative routes to prevent bottlenecks, employed deception measures that misled Luftwaffe targeting, established mobile repair units on sled-mounted platforms, used timber beams, sand, brushwood, and refrozen slush to reinforce ice. What the Germans initially thought was crude improvisation turned out to be a sophisticated, dynamically evolving engineering system, one that rivaled the logistical planning of any Western army. A German engineer officer remarked, "We mistook their desperation for incompetence. It was, in truth, innovation born under the gun." The unknown soldiers of the ice. While war histories often focus on generals and armies, the Road of Life was built by men and women whose names never appeared in newspapers. They were factory workers, students, elderly carpenters, fishermen familiar with Ladoga's moods, teenagers barely old enough to hold tools, women carrying logs across the ice with frozen fingers. Many collapsed where they stood, overtaken by exhaustion or cold. Some slipped into fissures, never to be recovered. Others died under air attacks or while dragging broken trucks out of danger zones. The Soviet state rarely recorded their individual stories, yet the Road of Life was carved by their footprints, their sweat, and their sacrifice. A Red Army officer said at the time, "These people were not soldiers, but they fought harder than many soldiers ever could." The Germans, too, recognized the invisible army behind the ice road. Where do they find such people? A shaken sergeant asked after capturing a teenage volunteer who had survived 3 days repairing ice under bombardment. A lifeline too resilient to kill. During the second winter, the German attempts to break the road became more desperate, but they still underestimated the Soviets' capacity to adapt. Artillery? The Soviets shifted routes nightly. Bombing raids? They built smoke screens and decoy markers. Direct air assaults? They deployed mobile AA guns and fighter escorts. Ice melt? They used patch crews to rebuild damaged sections in real time. For every kilometer the Germans destroyed, the Soviets rebuilt too. A frustrated German staff report concluded, "We attacked the ice. We should have attacked the people." But that, of course, was impossible. The engineers and workers were everywhere and nowhere, blending into the cold, working at night, repairing the road as fast as it broke. Ladoga becomes a symbol of Soviet identity. By late 1943, the Road of Life had taken on mythic status inside the Soviet Union. It became a symbol used by teachers, political officers, and newspapers to rally the population. To many Soviet citizens, the road was not just a physical path. It was a metaphor for the endurance of the motherland. Frozen, cracked, bombed, battered, but unbroken. Schoolchildren memorized poems about the Road of Life. Artists painted epic scenes of trucks crossing moonlit ice. Composers wrote symphonies dedicated to the lake. Inside Leningrad, families lit candles on winter nights for drivers who had vanished beneath the ice. Some walked to the shoreline of Ladoga wearing black armbands, as if visiting a cemetery without graves. The psychological power of the road was so strong that even the Germans noticed. One officer wrote, "We killed their soldiers, we starved their people." Yet a road made of ice gave them more strength than all their armies. The Road of Death, German casualties in the north. The Germans often believed they were the ones besieging Leningrad, but in many ways the environment was besieging them. In the forests, swamps, and frozen marshlands south of the lake, German soldiers suffered from frostbite, fuel shortages, starvation, widespread disease, low morale, trench foot, wildlife attacks, ammunition rationing, supply delays from Germany. The irony was bitter. The Soviets had a lifeline. The Germans did not. Their own supply routes from Pskov to Muga were constantly disrupted by partisans and Red Army counterattacks. Some German units went days without fuel. Others reported eating horse meat frozen on the roadside. A diary entry from a German corporal reads, "We are the ones trapped. The Russians have the lake. We have nothing." Hitler refuses to accept reality. Despite repeated warnings, Hitler refused to lift the siege or redirect additional resources to Army Group North. He continued to insist that the subhuman city should be starved, not captured. His orders were clear. Leningrad must be erased. But by now, the road of life had proven him catastrophically wrong. Every day, Leningrad received supplies. Every day, Soviet divisions strengthened. Every day, German morale eroded. Hitler's refusal to adapt sealed the fate of his northern armies. A strategy unravels. By the end of 1943, it was obvious to every German officer in the region. The siege had failed, the road of life had saved Leningrad, and the German campaign would never recover. Even worse, the Soviets were preparing for another major offensive, one that would push the Germans back from the city they had tried to strangle. The Germans had lost the Battle of Winter Logistics, and in doing so, they had lost the strategic advantage on the northern front. January 12, 1943. The day the Germans realized the road of life had done more than keep Leningrad alive, it had bought the Red Army time to sharpen its sword. After months of secret preparations, Soviet forces of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts launched Operation Iskra, Spark. The objective: pierce the narrowest section of the German siege line near the southern tip of Lake Ladoga. The Germans believed the terrain was impregnable. Marshes, forests, frozen rivers, bottlenecks, terrain they thought favored defense. But Soviet reconnaissance had mapped every bunker, trench, and machine gun nest. Artillery was massed with mathematical precision. And thanks to the road of life, the Soviets had the ammunition, fuel, and manpower to attempt the impossible. For 10 brutal days, the Red Army hammered the German 170th and 227th Infantry Divisions. Trenches turned into craters of smoking ice and mud. Machine gun nests vanished under 152mm shells. Tanks pushed forward through frozen marshes, their treads clattering like chains dragging across steel. On January 18, 1943, Soviet assault groups met in the village of Schlisselburg. The blockade was broken. A land corridor, only 10 to 12 kilometers wide, but enough, was opened. For the first time since 1941, Leningrad was physically connected to the rest of the Soviet Union. As news spread through the city, people embraced in the streets. Some collapsed from emotion. Others simply cried. A Leningrad woman wrote, "For 17 months we lived in a city of ghosts. Today we became human again." The Germans' reel from the consequences Operation Iskra didn't end the siege, but it changed everything. Supplies now came by rail, ammunition stocks surged, civilians were evacuated in larger numbers. The road of life became a secondary artery. German morale in the north cratered. Hitler's dream of starving Leningrad died. German commanders were stunned by the scale of Soviet preparation and the force of the attack. A staff report from Army Group North stated, "The Russians did not simply endure the winter, they used it to prepare an offensive that we failed to anticipate." Many German soldiers began to sense a shift in the war. Soviet forces that once retreated in chaos now attacked with discipline, fast coordination, and frightening resolve. And they realized too late that the backbone of this Soviet resurgence was the lifeline across Lake Ladoga. The road of life evolves once again. With the land corridor established, the Soviets began building a new supply system. A narrow-gauge railway, nicknamed the Victory Line, was laid down at extraordinary speed across the reclaimed territory. Meanwhile, the road of life continued to operate during winter seasons, functioning as an auxiliary route for heavy loads and overflow traffic. It was now a truck road in winter, a naval route in summer, a railway corridor after Iskra Halist. 3 layers of logistics, all overlapping, all feeding Leningrad. Never again would the city face hunger on the scale of the first winter. The Germans knew this, and it terrified them. A German prisoner confessed, "We thought the Russians were broken, but the lake rebuilt them." German attempts to break the new corridor. Hitler refused to accept the loss of the blockade. He ordered Army Group North to retake the corridor at all costs. But the Germans were no longer the unstoppable machine of 1941. Manpower was stretched. Supplies were dwindling. Luftwaffe presence had shifted south. The Eastern Front demanded reinforcements. Winter had become an enemy, not an ally. Every German counterattack failed. Every attempt to cut the corridor bled divisions white. Every artillery barrage was answered by Soviet guns twice as numerous. The once tight siege had become a loose noose, and it was slowly slipping from German hands. Leningrad strikes back. With supplies restored, Leningrad began to rise from the ashes. Factories resumed full-scale production. Artillery units, once rationing every shell, fired with new confidence. fresh divisions formed within the city, composed of survivors hardened by starvation and grief. These new units fought with a kind of fury the Germans had not seen before. They were not just defending their homes, they were avenging their dead. A German soldier captured near Signavino said, "They move like people who refuse to die. They fight like the ice." The symbol Germans couldn't kill. As the Soviets prepared for new offensives in late 1943, the Road of Life became more than a logistical achievement. It became a symbol of defiance broadcast across the entire Soviet Union. Posters showed trucks roaring across frozen waves. Radio broadcasts honored the drivers who vanished beneath the ice. Schoolchildren wrote essays about Ladoga's White Road. Art exhibitions depicted the lake as a guardian spirit. Poets romanticized the ice as the shield of the motherland. Even Soviet generals knew the psychological effect was as important as the physical one. Marshal Zhukov wrote, "Leningrad did not survive because we defended it. It survived because its people refused to die." The lake, silent, vast, and deadly, had become the city's protector. The Germans' growing fear. By late 1943, with the blockade shattered and the Red Army preparing a larger offensive, German soldiers began whispering a new phrase in the trenches, Der See gibt ihnen Kraft. The lake gives them strength. To them, the Road of Life had taken on an almost supernatural quality. No matter how the Germans attacked, artillery, bombs, starvation, the Soviets always found a way to rebuild it. The Road of Life had become the embodiment of the enemy they had underestimated. Adaptive. Relentless. Unbreakable. The Germans knew if the Soviets could build a highway across a frozen lake under fire, there was nothing they wouldn't try next. And they were right. By late 1943, Army Group North could no longer pretend the situation around Leningrad was stable. The ice road had broken the starvation plan. Operation Iskra had broken the encirclement. And now, the Red Army was massing for something even larger. An operation designed not merely to relieve the city, but to evict the Germans from the entire region. German officers along the entire front sensed the shift. Their men were exhausted. Their trenches flooded in autumn rains. Their ammunition stocks were a shadow of 1941 levels. Worst of all, they faced a revitalized Soviet force supplied by Ladoga's summer convoys, the restored land corridor, the returning winter ice road. And behind it all stood a population that had survived what should have been impossible, the Soviet winter offensive of 1943 to 44. On January 14, 1944, almost exactly 1 year after Operation Iskra, Soviet forces unleashed a massive offensive known as the Leningrad-Novgorod Operation. It was the largest Soviet operation the northern sector had ever seen. 1.25 million Soviet troops, thousands of artillery pieces, fresh tank brigades, air support from newly reinforced air armies, logistical backing provided directly through Ladoga routes. The Soviets attacked along multiple axes, aiming to crush the German 18th Army and force a total withdrawal from the region. Artillery lit the sky for hours. The ground shook like thunder rolling across the ice, and the Germans, caught between frozen swamps and relentless infantry, began to fall back. One German officer wrote, "The Russians did not simply return. They arrived like a storm we could not outrun." German lines collapse. Throughout January 1944, German defensive positions crumbled faster than expected. Units that had once boasted elite reputations, like the 1st Infantry Division and 21st Luftwaffe Field Division, were overwhelmed by Soviet firepower and numbers. Key strongpoints fell one after another. Rapsha, Pushkin, Slutsk, Signavino Heights. The Germans fought fiercely but could not hold. The Soviets had ammunition, fuel, manpower, and artillery in depths the Wehrmacht had not faced before in the north. And every Soviet shell, every Soviet tank, every Soviet bullet that reached the front had been made possible by the Road of Life. A captured German major put it simply, "We lost when the lake fed them. We just didn't know it yet." Leningrad's liberation, the end of 872 days. On January 27, 1944, Soviet troops defeated the last German forces near the city's southwestern outskirts. After 872 days, nearly 2.5 years, the siege of Leningrad was finally broken. The celebrations inside the city were overwhelming. Air raid sirens were replaced with fireworks. Factories blew horns for hours. People flooded the streets despite the cold. They were thin, scarred, and exhausted, but unbroken. A woman who had survived the worst of the famine wrote, "The siege did not end in a single moment. It ended with every truck that crossed the ice." The Germans retreat, haunted by the ice road. The Soviet winter offensive pushed the Germans back 70 to 100 kilometers from their former positions. Towns they had occupied for years were retaken in weeks. The German front line, once so confident, crumbled into a disorderly retreat. German diaries from the period show a recurring theme: disbelief that the Soviets had managed to survive long enough to counterattack. One entry reads, "Had the lake frozen thinner, had the ice cracked sooner, had our bombers struck them harder, perhaps it would have ended differently. But the ice had held. The trucks had crossed. The lake had saved a city and destroyed a strategy." The road of life in German memory. After the war, German officers interviewed by Allied interrogators repeatedly mentioned the road of life as one of the most unexpected and consequential factors of the Eastern Front. Some described it as an engineering feat beyond anything they anticipated. Others called it a miracle that no commander could have predicted. Many simply confessed that it broke their morale. One former officer summarized, "We starved them. We froze them. We shelled them. But they built a road across water and defied us." It was a sentence that captured the failure of the siege better than any official report. A city reborn from ice. By the end of 1944, Leningrad was no longer the starving fortress it had been in 1941. It was now a symbol of sacrifice, endurance, and national pride. Its people returned to work. Factories roared back to life. Children played in courtyards once filled with rubble. Streets reopened. Shops restocked. Leningrad was still scarred, still wounded, still grieving, but alive. And its survival was owed to a frozen path the Germans refused to believe could exist. The ice road that changed history. The road of life was more than a logistical improvisation. It was a turning point in the war, a moment when human ingenuity overcame nature and human will overcame starvation. It saved nearly 1 million lives. It preserved an entire city. It exposed one of the greatest strategic miscalculations of the Wehrmacht. And it marked the beginning of a shift in the Eastern Front that would eventually drive the Germans back to Berlin. The Germans had mastered blitzkrieg, artillery, tanks, and tactics. But they had not mastered the one thing the Soviets wielded better than anyone: endurance. And nothing symbolized that endurance more than a road carved across ice, the human cost beneath the frozen highway. Though the road of life is remembered as a miracle, its human toll was staggering. Soviet records suggest that more than 6,000 drivers, engineers, and volunteers died on Lake Ladoga during the first winter alone. Many vanished without a trace, swallowed by fissures that opened silently in the dark or crushed beneath collapsing slabs of ice. Families in Leningrad kept small shrines on windowsills, candles flickering through frost as they waited for loved ones who never returned. Most would never know their fate. One diary found after the war described the terror of the ice road. At night, the lake groans. Sometimes it sounds like a scream. We drive forward anyway. Bodies were often unrecoverable. Trucks, cargo, and men sank into the black cold, where they remain to this day, preserved in the lake's dark silence. It was a supply line, but also a mass grave. The psychology of the road, Soviet and German perspectives. For those who lived through the siege, the road of life became a symbol not just of survival, but of identity. The people of Leningrad came to see Ladoga as a protective force, a silent guardian that stood between them and annihilation. A Soviet poet wrote, "In our hour of need, the lake became our shield." The Germans, however, viewed it as an enigma, an enemy they could never fully comprehend. They respected it, feared it, and cursed it in equal measure. A German tank commander confided after the war, "No matter how hard we hit them, the Russians returned with supplies. It was as if the lake itself fought for them." This wasn't just a tactical oversight, it was a psychological defeat. The Germans never understood how the Soviets could function under such relentless pressure. They had assumed starvation would break Leningrad in weeks. Instead, the ice road gave the city a lifeline, and the Germans a nightmare. The road of life in the second winter. When the road of life reopened in the winter of 1942-43, it was no longer an improvisation. It was a refined, reinforced, militarized artery. Convoys tripled in size. Sled-mounted AA cannons covered every approach. Fire brigades protected the ice from incendiaries. Engineers developed a system of pressure ridges to absorb shock waves. Alternate routes were plotted in advance. Drivers were trained specifically for ice navigation. German attacks grew more precise, but the Soviets countered every tactic. Bombers, smoke screens, artillery, mobile repair units, cracks, rapid freezing teams, meltwater, wooden bridges, and slush layers. By now, the Germans had learned one painful truth. You can't starve a city that refuses to stop rebuilding its lifeline. The road of life in the Soviet war machine. Ladoga's supply routes did more than save civilians. They revitalized the frontline forces defending the city. Thanks to the steady flow of supplies, artillery units regained striking power, ammunition shortages eased, tank brigades received fuel and spare parts, anti-aircraft units were resupplied, replacement soldiers poured into the city. Factories resumed limited but critical production. This was crucial for Operation Iskra and later offensives. Without the Road of Life, the Red Army around Leningrad would have been too weak to launch any meaningful counterattacks. A Soviet general famously said, "Our artillery fired with Ladoga in every shell." And he was right. The myth and memory after the war. When the war ended, the Soviet Union immortalized the Road of Life in memorials, museums, films, poems, and school textbooks. It became one of the most sacred symbols of Soviet wartime resistance, standing alongside Stalingrad, Moscow, and Kursk. But what made the Road of Life unique was that it honored ordinary civilians as much as soldiers. During the annual Day of the Road of Life, veterans, drivers, engineers, volunteers would gather at the lake's edge, staring out across the water that had once been ice. Many cried. Some whispered the names of lost comrades. Others remained silent, the memories too heavy to voice. A granite memorial was erected at the shoreline, bearing the simple inscription, "No one is forgotten." Why the Germans never understood it. For the Wehrmacht, the Road of Life was a logistical aberration, something impossible within their own operational doctrine. They viewed war as a matter of efficiency, supply lines, planning, discipline. But the Road of Life was built on something the Germans did not factor into their calculations: desperation combined with collective resolve. The Soviets did not build the ice road because they were prepared. They built it because there was no alternative. A German colonel later admitted, "We believed they would behave like us. That was our mistake." The Road of Life was not logical. It was not efficient. It was not safe. But it worked because the Soviets were willing to sacrifice everything to keep it open. The road beneath the water today, beneath the dark waves of Lake Ladoga, the remnants of the Road of Life still rest. Splintered timbers, rusted truck frames, lost cargo, ammunition crates, human remains. Archaeologists occasionally find artifacts washed ashore, metal fittings, frozen boots, fragments of glass. Each object is a reminder that the road did not simply lie on the lake. It sank into it, piece by piece, life by life. The Road of Life was a triumph, but it was paid for in ice, steel, and blood. Winter 1943-44. As the third winter of the siege descended, Lake Ladoga froze once more. But this time, the ice road was not a desperate improvisation, nor a fragile miracle. It was a proven system, refined through 2 brutal years of trial and error. The Soviets treated the lake as if it were an extension of their rail network. Engineers had blueprints, protocols, reserve routes, and logistical schedules prepared months in advance. Convoys were now escorted by armored cars on reinforced ice. Trucks were equipped with specially studded tires designed for maximum traction. And every driver crossing the lake had already survived 2 winters of its fury. A German observer wrote bitterly, "They have turned the ice into a weapon, and they wield it with mastery." Even German intelligence admitted that Soviet efficiency on the ice had reached an industrial scale. The road operated with the predictability of a railway and the ruthlessness of the front line. The final German attempts to intercept the lifeline. Despite the collapse of the blockade the previous year, the Germans still tried to disrupt Ladoga's traffic. They believed that any blow, however small, might slow the Soviet advance, but their efforts were doomed by this point. Luftwaffe airfields were outnumbered and undersupplied. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. AA fire near the lake was overwhelming. German artillery had been pushed too far back to reach the ice. Soviet fighters patrolled the skies day and night. Ladoga had become a Soviet stronghold. A Luftwaffe pilot noted in frustration, We saw the smoke screens long before we saw the ships, and by then it was already too late. The Germans were spectators now, watching an enemy they once dismissed as disorganized operate logistics at a scale they could no longer challenge. Leningrad recovers its strength inside the city. Life, though harsh, was returning. Schools reopened in bombed-out buildings. Theaters staged small performances. Families replanted gardens and courtyards where snow had covered unburied dead during the famine winter. Factories along the Neva roared back to life, producing weapons used later in the liberation of the Baltic. The painful irony for the Germans was clear. The very city they had tried to starve was now contributing to the war machine that would drive them out of Eastern Europe. Bread rations increased. Electricity returned in intermittent bursts. Hospitals expanded services. Children drank warm soup instead of hot water. And even the sound of artillery, still present, still deadly, felt less terrifying when one's stomach was full. One Leningrad resident wrote, "We live in ruins, but we live. That is our victory." The Germans brace for the blow. They know is coming. Army Group North had watched its siege fail in slow motion. First the ice road, then the summer convoys, then Operation Iskra, then the Victory Railway, then the Soviet winter offensive, and finally the total collapse of the blockade. By late 1943 and early 1944, German troops understood what their leaders refused to admit. They were no longer besieging Leningrad. They were defending themselves from Leningrad. Soldiers dug trenches with numb fingers. Artillery crews rationed shells. Officers whispered about withdrawing to Estonia. Entire divisions, frozen, exhausted, and bitter, began to accept the inevitable. A German captain wrote in a letter home, "When history asks why we failed, the answer will be Ladoga. That lake fed the Russian armies that now come for us." The last ice road convoy. In early 1944, the final major convoy crossed Lake Ladoga. Drivers watched the shoreline with mixed emotions, relief that the ice season was ending, pride in having survived another year, and sorrow knowing that many of their comrades lay beneath the frozen depths. When the trucks reached the eastern shore, engineers quietly dismantled markers, lanterns, and guideposts. This time, the road was not destroyed by meltwater or artillery. It simply wasn't needed anymore. The land corridor and railway were enough. The city no longer depended on the lake for survival. The road of life had completed its mission. Aftermath. A lake that became a legend. By the spring of 1944, Lake Ladoga returned to its natural state, a cold, windswept expanse of dark water. But for those who had lived through the siege, it was no longer merely a lake. It was a graveyard, a savior, a battlefield, a monument, a symbol. Children born during the siege grew up hearing stories of drivers who vanished into the ice. Veterans visited the shoreline like pilgrims. Mothers touched the water with their fingertips, whispering names of loved ones lost. And every person in Leningrad knew a simple truth. Without the road of life, the city would have died. The Germans' final judgment. After the war, Allied interrogators repeatedly asked German officers why the siege of Leningrad failed. Their answers varied in detail, but not in essence. Some blamed Hitler, some blamed the weather, some blamed logistics, some blamed Soviet stubbornness. But the most honest officers admitted the real reason. We did not believe they could build a road where none should exist. We underestimated resolve. We underestimated their engineers. We underestimated their will to live. The siege of Leningrad became a story not only of tragedy, but of miscalculation. The road of life exposed a fatal flaw in German strategic thinking. They understood war, but they did not understand endurance. By mid-1944, long after the last major convoy had crossed the ice, the Soviet High Command began analyzing the road of life as a case study, an example of what had worked, what had nearly failed, and what could be adapted for future operations. The conclusions were stunning. The ice road had forced the Soviet Union to reinvent its logistics doctrine. Before the war, Soviet supply planning relied heavily on railways and traditional depots. But Ladoga proved that war on the Eastern Front required something far more flexible. The Red Army learned to build mobile supply hubs, maintain shifting, adaptive routes, use natural terrain as logistical assets, deploy repair units directly at the point of need, sustain operations under constant enemy pressure, blend civilian and military labor into unified systems. These lessons would later influence Soviet movements at Kursk, Operation Bagration, and even the advance into East Prussia. A Soviet general writing after the war compared the road of life to a university. Ladoga was our academy. On its ice, we learned what logistics truly means in war. How the road of life rewrote German expectations. While the Americans and British later marveled at the Red Army's endurance, the Germans were the first to realize just how fundamentally the Soviets had changed their logistical methods. German reports prior to 1941 described the Soviet Union as slow, rigid, uncoordinated, and backward in supply. But Ladoga shattered that assumption. After 1943, German intelligence assessments began to shift markedly. Russian adaptability exceeds previous estimates. Enemy engineering units show exceptional capacity for improvisation. Civilians are mobilized at a scale unmatched in Europe. The Russians can sustain themselves even when supply lines appear impossible. This was not admiration. It was fear. One German officer summarized the shift bluntly. We planned for an army. We fought a nation. The families who lived because of the road. The road of life is often quantified in tonnage. Food delivered, shells transported, civilians evacuated, but its true impact can be measured in the stories of those who survived. A father who once boiled leather belts to feed his children lived long enough to see victory. A mother saved enough flour from Ladoga deliveries to bake tiny New Year's cakes for her daughters. Entire orphanages were evacuated alive across the ice. Thousands of elderly survived winters that should have killed them. These are the quiet triumphs of the road. One evacuee, who crossed the lake at age 9, recalled, "The truck smelled of gasoline and wool blankets. The driver told us not to look down. I held my sister's hand and prayed the ice would hold. It did. That is why I lived." Every person who walked the streets of Leningrad after the war was a testament to the ice. The road of life as a cultural wound. Despite its heroism, the road of life left scars that would never heal. Survivors often spoke of the lake with a mixture of gratitude and dread. Some could not bear to visit Ladoga again. Others avoided discussing the road at all, and many who worked on the ice suffered nightmares for decades. The memory of people vanishing into black fissures haunted entire families. A driver wrote in later years, "I loved the lake. I hated the lake. It saved us. It killed us." The German side of the memory. For German veterans, the road of life became a symbol of the enemy's unimaginable resilience. Many regarded it as one of the most confounding Soviet achievements of the war. One officer reflected, "We trusted our maps, our reports, our logic. The Russians trusted necessity. Necessity is stronger." Some Wehrmacht soldiers admitted that when they first heard of the ice road, they thought it a myth. When reconnaissance confirmed it, they believed it would collapse. When it endured, many felt a quiet dread. It became a reminder that the war was turning against them, not only in the south at Stalingrad, not only in the center at Kursk, but in the north, on a frozen lake they could not kill. Strategic consequences. Beyond Leningrad, what began as a desperate improvisation had enormous strategic ripple effects. It prevented the fall of Leningrad. It tied down dozens of German divisions. It preserved a major industrial center. It allowed Soviet forces to launch northern offensives. It sustained a million-strong population behind the lines. It denied Hitler a major propaganda victory. It enabled the eventual eviction of German forces from the Baltic. Most importantly, it forced the Wehrmacht into a multi-year siege that drained supplies and manpower it could never replace. Had Leningrad fallen, Germany could have redeployed at least 20 to 30 divisions to other fronts, perhaps changing battles from Stalingrad to Kursk. The road of life helped ensure those divisions remained trapped. The paradox of the road. The ice road was both, a triumph of logistics and a monument to human suffering. It demonstrated the best of human resolve and the worst of the conditions that made such resolve necessary. It was a line of hope drawn across a frozen graveyard. And yet, without it, millions more would have died. The legacy carved into history. By 1944, the road of life had already become legend. By 1945, it was immortal. By the post-war era, it was sacred ground. Today, historians call it one of the most extraordinary logistics achievements in modern warfare. Engineers call it impossible. Survivors call it salvation. Germans called it a nightmare. The world calls it the road of life. But those who built it, crossed it, and died on it, knew a deeper truth. The road of life was not merely a feat of engineering, it was a declaration that a city would not surrender.